Welcome again to a new edition of Good Books Radio. I'm your host, Dr. W.F. Strong, introducing a new book today, The Explorers by Martin Dugard. Martin is best known perhaps for his works with O'Reilly, with Bill O'Reilly. He co-authored Killing Lincoln, Killing Kennedy, and Killing Jesus. Those books collectively sold 6 million copies. So he's worked closely with Bill O'Reilly in writing blockbusters. But he's also been a historian for some time. He wrote a really well-known, well-received, critically acclaimed book called Into Africa, which was the coverage of the famous expeditions by Stanley and by Livingstone first, and then Stanley going in search of Livingstone. And this book is about, it's called The Explorers because what he wanted to do was to look at all the great explorers in history and to see what kinds of traits they had in common, and he narrowed it down to 7 traits. He's going to talk about those 7 traits in just a moment. Before we get there, I want to thank our underwriter, audiobooks.com, where your first book is free, so try it out. We're going to welcome now Martin Dugard. At what point in your life did you get interested in explorers?
I began my writing career as what happened was I had a corporate gig back when I first got married and first got out of college, and I just hated it, and so I began doing, it's just cubicle life, and I think most writers are otherwise unemployable. We're just not fit for anything else. So I began doing magazine stuff on the side, and mostly sports, mostly endurance sports. But sports writing can be kind of a ghetto unless you cover major sports and you have all the connections. And I began writing books in 1998, and I did a book about extreme sports. But I had a history minor in college, and I'd always been kind of a history geek, and I'd always loved the explorers. And so when my agent suggested as a follow-up to that book about adventure sports that I kind of maybe branch out into history, he didn't really have an idea in mind, but I immediately wanted to do something about the explorers. Mm-hmm. And I didn't want to do it the way that people usually did exploration, which was to tell the story in a very academic, very thoughtful, very footnoted. I wanted to tell like this adventure yarn, and that's kind of where I got into explorers, and that's where I kind of began to modify the style that I keep working on to this day, just to make I feel like what these guys did was thrilling and adventurous, and I want to make the words rise off the page in the same way. So it doesn't read like a sleeping pill. It reads like a thriller. And I began with Captain Cook, who just went everywhere, which is great because as a writer, you have to go where they go if you want to tell the story properly. So I kept having these excuses to go to Australia, to New Zealand. My wife was beside herself. It's like, no, honey, I really need to go to Australia now. And then I did Columbus. Then I did Stanley Livingstone, which is the whole Africa adventure, and then I went on to Columbus, which was the whole the Caribbean, which was also another great excuse to get out of the house and do something somewhat adventurous.
So you just can't sit behind a desk. You have to go relive the adventure of the original adventurer.
Yeah, because I've tried it. I've tried sitting behind the desk, and at some point, it's weird. Like when I go to research, if I travel with other people, they always look at me as if I'm not really researching, because I'm not. When you go to these places, you can't quantify what the air smells like, or what the sunrise looks like, or that tang of the dust in the dry grass as you go through Africa, or the look of an acacia tree with the sun setting behind it. All those things enter into the story, but you have to see them for yourself to really make them something you can describe in vivid detail for the reader.
Well, you also followed the trail of Burton and Speke, right?
I did. And the interesting thing about their path is it is now the route of the Tanzania National Railway. So it's relatively easy to follow, but we did it in a car, which led to some kind of misadventures along the way. But the great thing about it is, even though Burton and Speke was 1854, it's so long ago, once you get outside of Dar es Salaam and you get into that wilderness, there's just one road going up into the savannah. And once you kind of rise up from the lowland coastal plain and you kind of crest that thing and you just look before and you see the vast African plain before you, it's the same thing they saw. It hasn't changed that much other than the paved road and the railway in 170 years. It's fantastic.
And do you sit there and say, how could they possibly do this?
Yeah, yeah. And that's one of the things with this book, with the explorers, that kind of, if you read the book, that goes off on a number of tangents about the various character traits of the explorers, because at some point I was looking at all of this and saying, how do these guys do it, and what do they have that I don't have that stops me from being one of those guys?
Well, you must have some of it if you care enough to go and follow in their footsteps.
Well, that's the thing. I feel like, in the normal context of the world, I feel like I've got that thing that they have, but they had it to a different degree, and I think that's what really prompted the thought, because we all know a lot of people who do a lot of outdoor stuff, and it's one thing to really love the outdoors and love adventure and love the unknown, and then it's a whole other thing to step off of a ship and know that you're going to travel 1,000 miles into an unexplored, unmapped, uncharted continent, and there's all these diseases and predators and snakes, and you're not going to be able to communicate with your loved ones for 1, 2, 3 years. That's a whole nother level of good juju.
Oh, and what mystifies me about Burton and Speke is that they tried it once before and they were both almost killed.
It was terrible. I mean, seriously, if you went to someplace and you're attacked on the beach and someone puts a spear through your mouth and then somebody else thrusts a spear tip into your quadriceps and they try to cut off your genitals, I wouldn't want to go back.
Yeah, exactly. They go back and they recuperate, and the first thing they start doing is looking for money to go back to Africa.
Yeah, and the thing was, they didn't speak to one another about going back, but when the time came that the expedition had been arranged, it was just kind of understood that they would be the ones that were going to be part of the trip. There was never any discussion about the fact that maybe they really didn't want to go back and do it again.
Well, you have actually done research and written books about really a lot of the people in search of the Holy Grail of their time, circumnavigating the globe, Columbus' obvious interest in the route to China. I think it's interesting that Columbus died without ever realizing he had discovered another continent.
No, Columbus is funny, because when I began writing the Columbus book, I kind of went into it with a lot of the modern misconceptions we have about Columbus, that he was this terrible, awful person who did bad things to the world. And yeah, he did some terrible things, so I'm not going to let him off the hook about that. But when you realize how he changed not just the world, but all of modern civilization, and he went to his grave thinking he was a failure. What a terrible thing to not be able to bask in your accomplishments.
Yes, he went. What is the story that he was on the coast, on the east coast of Panama, and some Indians were trying to convince him to go look at the water on the other side, and he just didn't buy it?
Yeah, and he didn't buy it, and it wasn't only like a 35 to 40 mile walk, albeit through some of the thickest, most treacherous jungle in the world.
Yeah, that's right.
But the point where he turned around, the point where he called it a day, is now the eastern mouth of the Panama Canal.
Oh.
I mean, he was right there. So it wasn't like he was, on one side of South America. He was right there.
Mm-hmm. So we have in these explorers some stories of just stupendous triumph and some missing it by an inch kind of thing, which is also very discouraging. I'm thinking of, Columbus, so to speak, being 35 miles away from understanding his great achievement. And then you have Scott, who, missed the South Pole by virtue of, a few weeks?
Just a few weeks. Yeah, just a few weeks.
Because Amundsen beat him.
Yeah, and I didn't like the way Amundsen did it, too. He taunted him. And remember, he pitched a tent, and he put the flag beside the tent. So they get there, they see the tent, and then they see the flag. So they know, that must have just, but I kind of blame Scott, too, because he didn't race to the pole. Remember, he stopped to look at rocks. He did all sorts of things along the way that he could have accelerated the pace, but he refused to kind of buy into that thing until it was too late, and then he lost the race. In a way, it was funny to me, when I began writing this book about Burton and Speke, it was supposed to be a straight narrative about Burton and Speke. And I had done, having done, Columbus and Stanley Livingstone and Cook, and had done that kind of straight adventure narrative. After about 3 months of writing, I found myself getting a little bit wouldn't say bored, but the construct of writing the traditional nonfiction adventure narrative basically says, here's your journey, keep it as exciting as possible, go from start to finish, and then maybe show the ramifications. And after about 3 months of that, I felt trapped within that narrative framework, and all these other explorers were kind of talking to me, and I started kind of riffing a little bit, trying to find ways to I wanted to bring Scott into it because I didn't want to write a whole book about Scott, but I wanted to compare his experiences with Burton and Speke, and I wanted to compare, Columbus and Cook and all these other people, and they all kind of started talking to me and squawking at me and trying to make their way into the narrative. And then the difficulty began taking their stories and not letting them overwhelm the central narrative, but accentuate it, give it greater context, give it greater emphasis. And then at some point, I just got really kind of playful with the whole thing. It's like, all right, if this is going to happen, let's just see where it goes. And I just started really just kind of letting these great explorers drive the story. And I like this book a lot just because it's fun like that. It's not your typical adventure book, but it's all about adventure, but in that spirit of adventure instead of that quite fusty academic thing. I think it's a lot of fun.
Well, it's also a book of self-discovery because through reading about these explorers, you can learn a lot about yourself.
Well, I mean, it's weird because, like I said, when I began looking at these traits that the explorers possessed, I wasn't trying to do something self-help or inspirational or something like that. I just kind of wanted to see what they had that I didn't have. And what I found was, that like you said, we all possess these traits. It starts with curiosity, then it goes hope, courage, passion, independence, self-discipline, and perseverance. These are the things that take anybody on any path on any point in their life where they try to do something that kind of stretches themselves. I mean, for me, when I quit the corporate world to become a writer, I had no money in the bank. I had 2 kids. I had no idea what I was doing. My wife encouraged me because she thought I had maybe something that could make me make it as a writer. But in that way, I kind of became a version of an explorer. And I think you look at everybody who's done anything, and whether it's Steve Jobs or it's Columbus or it's anybody who is attempting a marathon or you name it, it's kind of that same thing where you say, I'm going to step away from normal. I'm going to try something, and I'm going to kind of expand my own universe. And that's what I like, because as I explored the explorers, I found that applies to all of us. And I kind of gave it a universal quality that I thought some of my other books have been lacking.
But it's a wonderful approach, even if you stumbled upon it.
Oh, thanks.
I think, you come away, especially someone like me, about, I'd say 10 years ago or so, I said, I want to read the best explorer books there are, and I stumbled upon a list by National Geographic, the 100 best explorer books ever written, and it begins with Cherry's story about Scott's failed expedition, and that's a gripping, depressing read, but you want drama, it's got it in spades.
It's a phenomenal story.
And then I went from there to Livingston, and that's why when I picked up your book, having read a great deal in the explorer genre, I love that yours was the first book that tied them together and said, what can we learn from these guys?
Oh, thanks. Yeah. It was, the thing about explorers is I think they kind of get a bad rap. In this day and age, we kind of look at the explorers and we don't get them because we can't grasp that idea that there was a group of people who, for centuries, just chose to go into the unknown and kind of lead the way for the rest of us more, less adventurous souls. And they came back and told us what they'd seen. And to be able to kind of find a way to bring them all into one book was really fun. Like you said, it's the 100 best stories that I was able just to kind of cherry pick from, just to kind of help highlight another narrative.
Well, for me, I think that I can come to grips with the soul of these people and how far I am away from them by realizing when I look at the Burton and Speke journey, and you see things like coming down with cellulitis, and at that point I would say, no, I got to go home. I'm going to die out here. I got to go. In fact, probably just the first few days without mosquito repellent would have driven me, back home.
Well, then you think about it, they catch all these, they get dengue fever, they get malaria. Speke gets a beetle in his ear and he tries to poke it out with a knife. Next thing you know, he's got a hole in his ear. All this. I mean, at any point with any one of those diseases, I would have said, get me out of here. It's something. But you've been to Africa. You know what it's like. It's one of those places that it still has that vibe about it, where you kind of have to every day kind of challenge yourself to really kind of trying to keep up, because it really is a beautiful yet hostile place in so many ways, and so you have to be very careful.
Well, they say that everything's bigger in Texas, but I learned that it's really Africa where everything's bigger. I mean, the size of the beetles, the snakes, the insects, the animals, of course, it is hard to comprehend unless you're there. Even the size of the continent, most people don't understand. That you can put the entire United States in the Sahara Desert. That is a scale most people don't understand.
No, it's fascinating too, because, and then you think about the fact that these people, they didn't travel across on airplanes or cars. They largely walked, and they made about 8 miles a day. That was a good day, and and then they had to walk through, flooded rivers. They had to cross. There was one point in Livingston's the Stanley expedition where he had to cross a river that was covered in reeds, and he had to walk across on this carpet of reeds. But at one point, one of his donkeys fell through, and he could hear below. They could hear it as it fell through the hole and splashed into the water. They could hear the crocodiles eating the donkey alive. I mean, that's terrifying. I mean, that's.
But they thrived on that. Stanley was almost eaten by a lion, and then it became his kind of badge of honor over the years. I don't mean Stanley, I mean Livingston. Yeah.
Well, what's funny about these guys too? It's like you said, they did thrive on it because they were more comfortable in the unknown than they were in civilization. So they would go off on these expeditions of 2, 3, 4, 5 years. They'd come back, they'd write their book about it, they'd be in London, they'd be wherever they were, and then after a while they get restless again, and they want to go back and recreate that experience. And you see it with, Burton and Speke. Burton and Speke have their expedition. They come back. They fail the first time. The second time they come back, they've had this big blowout between them. Then Speke goes back with another partner, travels not just into Africa, but all the way the length of the Nile, comes out in Alexandria. And the same we see the same thing with Stanley. We see the same thing with Livingston. And at this point, and I touch upon this in the book too, Cook did the same thing in his explorers. At some point, they lose that discretion that says, maybe I need to stay home. Maybe people here would be happier if I didn't go out and risk my life one more time.
Well, and for themselves, they never ask the question as to whether their luck may have run out yet. they don't say, "Man, I was lucky to get out of there alive. I'm not going back." But it's just it's in their blood. They've got to live on the edge. It's like extreme sports, I guess.
Well, I touch upon this in the book a little bit too. And I learned a lot when I researched this. That whole concept of self-discipline and self-mastery, and it's not something you're necessarily born with. But what these people did, I compare it to Maverick and Top Gun, is this belief that if there's a specific job to do, they have acquired the specific skill set, and they have adapted their bodies in such a way and adapted their mind in such a way that they believe they're the only person that can accomplish that goal. So that's why these people kept going back in, and because at some point the exploration still had to be done, and they thought they were the only people who could get the job done. So why not go back?
Oh, something that you point out in the book is that every age had, its goal. For a while, it was the discovery of the Nile, and then it was climbing the highest peak in the world. And recently, it seems that one of the goals of the New Age explorers is the deepest place on Earth.
Yeah, you know what? I was just watching a TED Talk the other day, and I can't remember who the guy was speaking, but it was fascinating. And he was talking about that, and I think the number he threw out was 7%. Of all the creatures that we know of that live in the ocean, we know just 7%. So, and he compared the depths of the ocean with the rainforests, in that there are so many species that live there that we don't even know yet, that we haven't yet discovered, that, like you said, I think that is the next frontier. I mean, when Burton and Speke went into Africa, it was very much like the depths of the ocean. It was this dark, uncharted, unmapped, unknown. And now that's, because now that we know about everything else, we know about Africa, we know about Australia, we know about all these continents, but we don't know about the depths. And it's that same analogy, just that complete unknown that is a little bit terrifying, but at the same time is a little bit fascinating because it is so unconquered.
And then you have a few guys like, I think his name is Bill Stone, who is trying to, he's a spelunker. He's trying to find the deepest cave on Earth. And, the one thing that frightens me about these guys is not enough to go caving. They take scuba gear so they can dive through the underwater rivers to get to an even deeper place.
I can't tell you, how much that terrifies me.
I'm with you.
And you read about these guys, and they take their tanks up so they can wriggle through a smaller hole, and they have a rope to show them the way, but that's crazy. That's just out there.
But you're kind of an extreme adventurer yourself. You've done the what is the name of that extreme race that you've been involved in?
Oh, the Raid Gauloise. I did that 3 times. And
what is that about?
They don't do it anymore, which is too bad. It was a big French race, and they basically you had 5-person teams. Each team had to have at least one woman, and you raced across some of the world's most forgotten terrain, and it had to all be human-powered locomotion, or I should say non-automotive. So you would climb, you would run, you would rappel, you would ride on horseback, you would whitewater raft, you would ocean kayak, and the race would be about 600 miles long, about 2 weeks in length, and you carried all your own food and water. You slept about an hour a night.
Oh my!
And there's a time in your life where you feel like that's the thing that you need to do to be complete. And I love it. It was kind of the making of me, I have to admit, because it's where I went from being the theoretical about it, what it was like to be an explorer, to kind of like, okay, this is the hardship. But they didn't just do it for 2 weeks; they did it for months and years. But it kind of flipped a switch within me. It made me really realize what it was like to really kind of push yourself to your mental, physical, and emotional limits.
What is the most dangerous spot you've ever been in, or position, so to speak, most dangerous situation in your life?
I would think it was the time that my buddies and I got arrested in Africa, and it was through no fault of our own. We were driving. We're at the border of Zambia and in Tanzania, and there's a point in this town of Tunduma where the road literally ends, and the savannah begins. So that you have this red paved road, and all of a sudden it abruptly ends. And our driver was this guy who apparently had some issues with the law. So whenever he saw a police station, he tended to speed up, and which is bad. And so we're driving through this small town, and the people were congregating in the road, and it was kind of one of those things where every time they saw people, they would disperse, and then the car would pass, and then they'd come back to the center of the road. Well, it just so happened we passed a police station. Our driver sped up. The people did not separate quickly enough, and the driver hit a pedestrian. And it was one of those things where it was no fault of our own. So we told the driver to stop the car, and we're getting out of the car to go see what was going on when this mob attacked us. And they came at us with sticks and clubs, and thinking we had intentionally run this person down. We ran back and got in the car, and we literally fled for our lives. And it took us about 5 hours to get to this town of Sumbawanga. And the whole time it was like an off-road safari, like the Baja 1000, because we're driving these dirt roads as fast as we can. We don't know if we need to get out of the country, if we're going to be incarcerated for something we didn't do. And, this big plume of dust going up behind the car. Meanwhile, we're driving through, we can't even get out of the car because this is the land of lions and elephants and all sorts of snakes and hyenas and stuff like that. So we don't even know what's going on. And then we get to Sumbawanga. There's a checkpoint there. They're waiting for us. The soldiers talk to the driver in Swahili, and he tells them in Swahili that I had actually been driving the car.
Oh,
and that,
no.
That I was at fault. And so next thing you know, we've got 2 soldiers getting in the back of the car with their AK-47s, and these guys, these are loaded weapons, but they kind of treat them like they're toys. And so the guy's literally, as he's getting into the car, he's pointing the barrel of his AK-47 right at my head. And then jamming it kind of into the roof liner of the car so that he could make room for it as he got into the back seat. And it was just one of those moments. You know Africa. It's just a land of body odor and kind of a feral smell to it. And it was just one of those things that you just never forget. And they took us to the local police station. They held us for 3 days, and they tried to decide our fate. And it turned out all along they weren't after us because this pedestrian had been hit. They were after us because there had been a hit and run on a car in the same town, and they thought we had done the hit and run on the car. And when they found the actual person who did it, then they let us go. And we got a different driver. And we let it, and then then we got out of there as quickly as we could, and we drove up to the town of Mapanda. And it should have been a beautiful drive because it was probably 5 or 6 hours, and it was literally through this beautiful forest where elephants were lining the road everywhere you looked. There were giraffes everywhere you looked. There were zebras. We couldn't have cared less. We just wanted out of the Zamboanga.
Wow, what a story!
It was I didn't tell my wife until long after I got back.
Because I would think the worst would be sitting there in jail and just no way to let people know what's happened to you, and no way to touch the outside world, and you unclear as to whether this is going to be 2 years or 2 days.
Yeah, it was one of those places too where we didn't have access to a telephone. It was we didn't have a satellite phone, which we would have needed to really get some kind of connection. And like you said, we weren't sure if Tanzania was the kind of place where they just kind of held you until they had a reason to put you on trial, or they just held you without a trial. We didn't even know what was going on. And we were pretty terrified. And then I had a friend who was with us who was extremely chatty, and he was the one they chose to interrogate, for the greatest part of the whole thing. And it was the funniest thing about the interrogation was when they interrogated, the first thing they wanted to know was our religion, because it was a Muslim country. The second thing they wanted to know was what was the name of our tribe. So I said, well, I'm part of the Californians. And he asked me how to spell it, and he wrote it down. So there was some levity in the middle of all that.
So that's your tribe, the Californians.
That's my tribe. We're the Californians. That's right.
That's a great story. So you ended up actually experiencing a little bit of what the explorers experienced, because they found themselves in very precarious situations. I think of, what is his name? I want to call him Polo, but he was a guy who was actually exploring the Niger and was taken prisoner for a couple of years before he managed to escape. He was a slave. Mungo Park.
Oh, Mungo Park, yeah.
Yeah.
He's another guy too. Mungo Park should have known. I mean, he went. He made his name on an expedition. He goes back home. He's established in Scotland, and what does he do? He goes back, and then he just disappears. Mm. An interesting footnote about Mungo Park was that there was a Scottish golfer shortly thereafter who was named after him. So he won the early version of the British Open. So if you look at the claret jug that they give for the British Open, the name Mungo Park is engraved on it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, a little bit of.
Well, great. Okay. Good to know that. Well, I'm sorry that we're out of time. I loved your book, The Explorers. It's a magnificent read. And what did O'Reilly think of it, your co-author? Well, he's not your co-author on this book, but you're on your own. But
no, Bill was very, very complimentary. I mean, we had such a great partnership, and I kind of did this. I did this between all the books. I did it, I started before Killing Lincoln. Actually, I started before Killing Lincoln came out, and then I did it between Lincoln and Kennedy, and then I finished it between Kennedy and Jesus, and then we did the final stuff between Jesus and the new book, which is Patton. So, and Bill could have been happier. I mean, he was really, really complimentary, and nice. He's a great guy. He really is.
The book, once again, is The Explorers. If you'd like to hear this interview again, you can get it on our Facebook page, Good Books Radio. On Facebook, you can like us there, link to it, and you pick up all of our shows way back for many years. Or you can go to our YouTube channel, Good Books Radio, on YouTube, and same thing, you can get all of our shows as podcasts. I think you'll like this book by Martin Dugard. It is a wonderful, wonderful read. It's good and tight, and it covers the 7 major characteristics of great explorers, characteristics of those people who, according to the old Star Trek dictum, boldly went where no one had gone before. For Good Books Radio, I'm signing off. Dr. W.F. Strong, have a good day.